life. And when we went to the deluxe edition, the second version, then I was writing most of it. So that's sort of how I got my professional start as a Marvel historian. Anyway, the 80s. What makes the 80s stand out in Marvel history, I think, is that, please come in. Oh, a canary's here.
Canary's here.
But anyway,
that's two tardies.
What you've got in the 80s is that it's 20 years since Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko started what we think of as the Marvel Age of Comics, and you had a generation of baby boomers like ourselves who grew up reading and being inspired by these comics, and by the 1980s, a number of them had managed to maneuver their way into the halls of Marvel itself, working as editors, writers, artists. Simultaneously, you have the growth of the beginning and the growth of the direct sales market, so that instead of comics just being sold on newsstands to mass audiences, you could actually do comics that were aimed at the fans of specific writers, specific artists, specific... I'm being sabotaged, aren't I? And specific characters. And this allowed people to do more sophisticated material in many cases.
Am I going to be tested on this?
No. Everything you do right will be bonus points. But this isn't going to be pass fail or anything like that.
Okay.
But, so you have a decade that starts in the 80s with some real classics. You have Chris Claremont and John Byrne in 1980, 1981, doing the Dark Phoenix saga, and Days of Future Past, the movie of which debuts on HBO tonight. You've got, and speaking of debuts and say on another place, Netflix, you also have, starting in 81, 82, you've got Frank Miller starting his work on Daredevil.
That stinky guy.
That stinky guy, yes, he's not here. I come from hang out in Hell's Kitchen all the time.
Hey Peter, are we ever going to get to talk?
So that you don't
It's lasting longer than the 80s.
Because otherwise...
Oh my God, I think I'm being sent home with homework.
And, don't worry, there's only a few lines left to this.
No, let's just start over again from the beginning.
So that, in the course of this decade, it's a very creative decade. You have these writers and artists who are doing projects they really wanted to do, that they're dream projects for them. So that in the course of the 80s, you have things happen like Walt Simonson's run on Thor. You've got Peter David starting his long decade.
He dreamed of turning Thor into a frog?
Yes.
Yes.
You have a decade-long run that Peter David did on Hulk starting in the 80s. You not only have things happening in major titles, you have all these interesting, lesser-known titles, lesser-known characters that are coming about, like Louise Simonson, Jim Griffin on Power Pack, or Peter Gillis and Brent Anderson on Strike Force Morituri, or Larry Hama as editor on the NAM, the most realistic war comic that has been done since the EC days. And this is also the decade in which you had the event comic, that universe-wide crossover stuff between Jim Shooter's Secret Wars 1 and 2 at Marvel and Crisis on Infinite Earths at DC. And these things have had legacies that affect modern comics today. You have Marvel publishing its first graphic novels. You have creator-owned books from Archie Goodwin's epic line. And by the end of the decade, as Jim was going to tell us, you have the people who became the founders of Image showing up at Marvel, doing the work that first attracted the attention of comics fandom. So,
The beginning of the end.
So, I'd like to start, Jim started at Marvel in the 70s. What would you say is the difference between Marvel in the 70s and what Marvel turned into in the 80s?
Well, before we do that, he just got here, so can you repeat the part?
No.
But, well, you know, the 70s was probably the biggest thing about it was
The drugs.
yeah, well, to me, comics were my drug, so I was left out of all that. But up until the 70s, Marvel was a relatively small company, and I think contractually limited to a certain amount of titles. And in the early 70s, they broke out of that, had a new distributor, a new deal, and now they were free to publish as many comics as they could crank out. And that meant they needed more people. And, so comics had been so stable for so many years. I don't think there were all that many people saying, oh, I want to work in comics. But there were a lot of fans and all that who worked in fanzines and all this stuff that, before computers and webzines and all that. And they were eager to break in. So I think the biggest thing in the 70s was Marvel was just exploding with lots of new people trying every kind of format they possibly could think of. No one back there, as far as I recall, ever envisioned a Marvel that was only superheroes. It was always throughout the 60s and certainly before that, the 50s, 40s. There was always multiple genres. There were funny animals, there were romance or westerns, war, anything you could think of. And certainly in the 70s, once they had the opportunity to expand, it was very much true to what Martin Goodman, the publisher, had always done with Marvel, which was, if they could spot any trend, they would hop on it and, more or less either imitate it or outright get the rights to it. So in the 70s, you saw, Marvel imitate the Warren magazines, Mad magazines, even a couple of pulp magazines, digest-sized magazines, comics of every kind. Anything, like they would license Planet of the Apes, I think 70s was like Kung Fu.
You had Master Kung Fu, and you had Iron Fist, martial arts, you had...
Yeah, so there was this rapid expansion.
Horrible.
Yeah, and I think it was, in some ways, there was a lot of creators who really thrived in this sort of chaotic creative environment where it was just so many titles were being added so often that the editors couldn't be as hands-on. I think perhaps, when did Shooter come in at Marvel?
79.
Yeah, 79. So I think in a sense Jim Shooter, it's almost like the 70s was all this expansion, adding in an influx of new people, and then the 80s, I think, was, if you had to really look at it objectively, I think, it's sort of like when now they were, in the form of Jim Shooter and Archie Goodwin and others, now trying to rein things in and control it and like focus it but still, no matter what, there was always, I think, whether it was the 70s or the 80s or the 90s or whatever, there was always a lot of good stuff, and there was always a lot of maybe not so good stuff, and so that's, to me, the big difference.
And also Stan was still there in the office in the 70s.
Yeah, I think he graduated from the editor-in-chief and art director to publisher, and Stan Lee's the first guy to say he's not a businessman. So I think he was only really the publisher for a year or so, and after he sort of didn't handle some of the business stuff correctly, he sort of became the figurehead publisher for the rest of the years. But he did have a big say. He would look at the covers. He had ideas for. I'm always learning more and more stuff that Stan did that I had no idea. I'll give you a quick example. When did this Punisher come out?
Like 71, so about 73 in there.
Yeah, like I always thought that Punisher is a great example of what I was talking about. In the 70s, there was a line of paperback magazines called The Executioner. There was movies like Death Wish and all that going on. So, Marvel was hopping on all the trends. So Jerry Conway came up with a character that was very much like the Executioner. And I think, according to Jerry, he and Len Wein, who I think at one, were involved in somehow. I think Len may have been the editor-in-chief at that point. And they had this character. They knew what they wanted it to be, but they didn't have a name. So they marched into Stan Lee. He, being the co-creator of the Marvel Universe, might be able to help them. And you know, these stories always make, because I've been in a similar position as these guys. You go in, you talk to Stan, and you say something, and then he comes up with an answer that makes you look like almost embarrassed that you had to ask. And this was a good example. You know, they show him a picture that probably John Romita designed, you know, the big skull on his chest and all that. And Stan, you know, asked him one question. You know, what does he do? And they said, he you know, goes after criminals and he punishes them. Stan says, the Punisher!
Which is a name Stan had used before for a robot that worked with Galactus.
Well, Stan never forgets. They say he has a bad memory, but he knows how to recycle stuff. Anyway, it's time for Nocenti to talk.
Yes, it is. It's, but, so, and you arrived in the 80s at Marvel. What did you think of the place? What did you expect? What did it turn out to be like?
I thought there'd be more drugs, sex, rock and roll. There was plenty of that. No, I don't know. I just, you know, there was a big cutout of Spider-Man and then Captain America, and I was not a comic reader. I had read Pogo and Dick Tracy when I was a kid. And my parents really didn't want comics in the house because back then they were kind of, you know, considered, I don't know what, yellow trash, yeah. So I met Jim Shooter and I started talking to him about, you know, bullshit, like, you know, Marshall McLuhan and Andy Warhol and all this stuff. And he went, get hired. And Virginia Ramita said to me, you don't smoke, do you? And because back then you could smoke in the offices. And she said, you don't smoke, do you? And I was a smoker. And I said, no. And since I don't like to lie, I quit that day. So Marvel Comics got me to quit smoking.
Marvel Comics saved her life.
Yes, saved my life. But there was an ad in the Village Voice for editorial writing work. It was very, very vague, and I called up, you know, and there was Lady Dorothy, remember Dorothy? She was the head of personnel, and she said, yes, it is editorial work. What do you publish? Oh, well, I'll tell you, you know, after I find out if you're interested. And I went, okay, pornography, yeah, I can write porn. But she was embarrassed to say Marvel Comics. And when, you know, there was the president of the company at the time, I think Jim Galt, was it? Galton. He used to go to cocktail parties or whatever and claim he was in children's publishing. He didn't even like saying that he was a comic book.
He would stand in the 50s.
Really? So, I mean, it's kind of like, you know, it was not really something that acceptable.
You wouldn't impress your friends unless
you
the right kind of friends.
No, if you had any friends, you know, you were not going to impress them by saying you wrote comics.
So you end up working on the X-Men. And what did you think of the X-Men when you first started working on it? What do you think? Why do you think it was appealing?
Well,
what does Chris Claremont really like to work with?
Well, I mean, one of the things about Marvel Comics back then was that you had amazing editors. Because the editors also either wrote, like, why isn't Larry Hama on this panel? He was in Marvel in the 80s and he's sitting right out there.
Making money.
Larry Hama would run around the office with like Xeroxes of Wally Wood's artwork and really try and like train everybody about good storytelling. You had Al Milgrom who would take a comic book page, put a sheet of vellum over it, and he would start redrawing what the artist had done. So for instance, if you had, you know, Spider-Man swinging, but the artist had like chopped his foot off, you know, Al would show how, well, if you did it this way, you wouldn't chop his foot off in the panel and lose the sense of lift and the sense of flying. And so you had, even Jim Shooter, he used to have these very Aristotelian rules that he would say, you know, what's the conflict? What's the obstacles? What's the theme? What's the, So you had Lee Simonson, Walter was up in the office a lot, you had Jim Salicrup, you had Mike Carlin, I mean, you had every single editor also either drew or wrote. And that was what's weird when I came back to comics a few years ago and started working for DC. It was the opposite. They weren't allowed to write and draw, except for, you know, the top people. But I mean, I used to think that was really weird. I'm doing comics for editors who have never written or drawn or anything. You know, so that was always very strange. It's kind of like in the film business when you work for a producer that doesn't really know how to make a movie. It's always like a little bit of a disconnect. So I think Marvel in the 80s, what you had was you had, you know, Archie Goodwin. I mean, who am I leaving out? Every single editor was phenomenal. Denny O'Neil, you know. So you had access to all these kind of a row of geniuses. Really, a row of comic geniuses, comic book geniuses, and comic geniuses in some cases. Like Mike Carlin, who got his start at SNL, right? As he famously likes to remember. Is that true?
I don't know, but I do know he writes on Facebook about SNL every week.
Yes, I think because you worked there for like 2 weeks and you know, he feels like his life peaked. So you had, it was a great training ground. And because, like Jim was saying, it wasn't all that sexy or popular to be in the comic book field yet, you basically got to try everything. I mean, I was a colorist. You know, I did, oh God, paste up and mechanicals. Remember those? You guys may even know what that is. Do you? Anyone know what paste up and mechanicals are? No.
Yeah, no, they have computers now. So.
They have computers now. In those days, you...
So when you copy and paste, we actually literally had to make copies and cut it
You
out.
had to cut
paste.
around the thought bubbles and glue the thought bubbles to the page with little dots. I mean, everything was done by hand. And we had, so, I don't know, I guess there was a bullpen, everybody was working, there was a great influx you had, you know, you'd be sitting there and Steve Ditko would be in your office talking to you. And I did a comic with Steve Ditko, and Bill Sienkiewicz was there, I mean, it was just, I would say that then I left the field, and when I came back, it felt very corporate and sterile, and it just didn't seem, but I'm assuming they're still having fun, I hope they are.
Well, I've been up to Marvel a few times, and I think it still comes off as corporate to me, but you just hit on something I think is important, which is that at Marvel and DC in the 80s, they actually welcomed having freelancers show up at the office.
Yes.
Whereas now, no, you only come by invitation only. At one point at DC, you had to, I'm told that you actually had to like call a day ahead in order to make sure that you could get in. You couldn't just show up because you had to go through security, and security had to have 24 hours notice.
Yeah, photo ID. You had to get a chip. Now you have to have a chip put in your eyeball. It's fingerprinted, mugshots.
But again, one of my questions earlier was, what did you think of the X-Men when you started to read them?
And remember, you're under oath.
Yes.
What was my editor's oath? Know where the bodies are buried and never tell anyone? Well, I had the amazing Louise Simonson who trained me to on how to work with Chris Claremont.
You should write a book with that title.
Yeah, exactly. She was pretty, I mean, Louise Simonson was like really an awesome talent, and one of the talents that she had was just, people would come into her office and she'd kind of sit there and rip apart everything they were doing, and they would leave as if she had just like blessed them or something. You remember that? So she kind of taught me how to work with Chris, you know, which wasn't hard at all. It was lots of fun. Well, you worked with him.
Of course.
What did you think of working with Chris?
It's like you go off to the local Asian restaurant for lunch, and because Louise always said you have to keep Chris well fed.
Yes, you have to feed him.
You have to keep his sugar levels high. And he would just have this outpouring of ideas, and You know, it had like 10 different storylines in mind that he could turn to. And of course, he had all these characters to juggle. And it was fun. It was all this outpouring of creativity constantly.
Do you guys read Chris's X-Men?
Yeah. Well, when I worked with him, it was I was taking over X-Men after Roger Stern was the editor, and Roger was sort of like really good friends with John Byrne, who was the artist. So I felt when I took over, like because when you have two incredibly creative people like John Byrne on one side and Chris Claremont on the other side, there's no lack for ego here. My job was more like being a referee, and I think that in some ways Roger, just because of his friendship with John, was maybe giving John somewhat preferential treatment. So, but I got along very well with John and with Chris, so I think Chris was surprised that suddenly someone was, really listening to him again, and it worked out well. Like sometimes you had to go, work out things between them, but...
because basically John and Chris were co-flying together.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
they wanted to go in different directions a lot of the time.
Yeah, so I was there up until, what is called the death of Phoenix, but Dark Phoenix, but in the issues I actually edited, which were, I think, later published in a one-shot called The Untold, story where Dark Phoenix winds up, Phoenix doesn't die.
Right,
But,
she loses her powers and she doesn't die.
yeah, but that was something where Louise Jones took over, where she came in and did the deed. Whereas I'm too nice to kill anyone.
Well, what's Louise's idea?
No.
She was basically the queen.
So she was just a hired gun. But no, I think Jim's idea to do it was what makes that story so memorable now, and I always give him all the credit.
Yes,
even
it
though-
wasn't disguised.
Yeah, that was great. It made sense. His misunderstanding of what our story was made it a much better story. So it worked out great.
Now, Jim, lots of things happened with Spider-Man during the 80s.
Oh, yeah.
So, for example, tell us about how did the wedding come about?
Somewhat prematurely, unfortunately. Again, going way, I mean, one of the things about doing any kind of serialized fiction is you're always trying to figure out how can you repeat enough or have enough of the elements that people want to see issue after issue if they like it. If they like any character, if it was Spider-Man, the X-Men, there's certain things they want to see all the time. But if you do it too much the same way over and over again, then fans will complain, hey, this is boring, it's just the same old stuff over and over again. Then if you do something too radically different, then you get people, well, that's not Spider-Man, that's not. So one day, I just happened to be, and this is how a lot of stuff happened at Marvel, walking down the hallway, and this very tall person who was the editor-in-chief, Jim Shooter, informs me that Stan Lee's thinking about what if we get Peter Parker and Mary Jane married. And I'd only recently taken over the Spider-Man titles, and I was looking for anything to sort of, shake it up. I think it had gone through long periods where, if we had to have, Marvel was publishing a book called the Marvel Triumph book. I don't know if anyone saw that. And it had like, almost like the most cliche Spider-Man story, which would be Spider-Man battling Dr. Octopus. So because of that book, which was almost the bane of my existence, I was bombarded with endless submissions of Spider-Man battling Dr. Octopus, as if that's all it was. So I was looking to find anything to make it more interesting and more, something that we could, have fun with. So when I heard that, Stan was entertaining that idea, I thought that's great. I mean, there used to be a show, you would know better, that was in the 70s, Moonlighting.
Yes.
You know, there's lots of shows, Cheers even, like, where X-Files, anything where you have like a male and a female lead characters, and you play up the chemistry of, you know, will they get together, will they not, and just the idea that we could build up to this thing was very exciting to me, and I thought that would be great. Because I thought Stan was asking, you know, theoretically down the line, can we, you know, what about we do this? And I thought, you know, at some point they'd come back to me and say, okay, we should start planning it, et cetera, et cetera. So again, a couple of months later, I run into Jim in the hallway, and he says, okay, they're getting married in June. And at this point, Mary Jane wasn't even in the comics really anymore. So I was like, nearly had a heart attack and didn't know what to do. I mean, all my dreams of like trying to have fun with the romance and, you know, playing, you know, teasing it, et cetera, was gone. We literally had to like scrap some of the issues that were in the works just to bring her back as quickly as possible. So on one hand, the fans, we got a lot of favorable feedback on, you know, getting them together. The wedding issue was, you know, considered, you know, very, very popular, et cetera. But, you know, from my point of view as the editor, it's almost like this major regret that, or a lost opportunity where I felt this was, like in my mind, going to be the source of material for at least a year. And then to have to condense it in like a month or two was not how I hoped it would play out. But there were even people like who I respect, like John Romita Sr., who certainly knows a thing or two about The Amazing Spider-Man, and they would have like this sort of conventional wisdom, like if you want to kill something off, just get the characters married. And I, you know, he would say, once Lil Abner got married, it was terrible, it killed the strip, blah, blah, blah. And I just thought it was being, you know, drummed into me as the Spider-Man editor so much that Spider-Man's all about with great power must come great responsibility. So what's more responsible than getting married, I thought, and what, you know, that entails. And so as it played out, it turned out like the years where Spider-Man was married up until that one day, where now it didn't happen, but I think now there's something going on where maybe they'll be married again, I don't know. But during that period, all the people who thought, you know, Spider-Man's, he has to be a teenager, that's all, you know, that's what kids relate to, and being a teenager, you know, not having a wife. So they tried everything since then, like Ultimate Spider-Man. Here, he's a teenager. No, the Amazing Spider-Man still sells more. No matter what they tried to do, you know, and when they finally undid the marriage, it's never, you know, the best-selling period of Spider-Man was when he was married, so go figure.
And really, wasn't he like married for as long as he had been, as a character had been unmarried before that?
Yeah, I mean,
generation grew up reading Spider-Man as marriage stories.
Yeah, and a big part of the original, you know, the baby boomers you mentioned, fans of Marvel Comics, so many key things that they were, you know, reading. I mean, nowadays there's changes every week to different titles are revamped and relaunched and, you know, retro, whatever. But in the 60s and 70s, there certainly on all the top titles, there was a lot of status quo. And even in the 60s, just a simple thing when Stan Lee and Steve Ditko had Spider-Man graduate high school, that was a big event. You know, like they figured, you know, Spider-Man's only been around a few years and he's already graduated high school. Archie's been in high school for how long? I mean, he'll turn into a zombie now, but he still hasn't graduated high school. So getting married was yet again another, you know, part that just seemed, if any character at Marvel, it made sense. You know, this was a character that was evolving. You know, like it was really. There have been too many years of Spider-Man to pretend he's still a teenager. You know, and he had too many adventures. You know, to make him, you know, that. You know,
and if young older was in fact part of the original Stan concept.
Exactly.
Eric, tell us how Longshot came about, which was the first big splash you made as a writer in Marvel.
Well, you've all gotten the chance to meet Art Adams today? Arthur Adams.
Neil Adams' son?
Well, he used to be Art Adams, now he's Arthur, I think, right?
You used to be Nocenti.
Yeah, I still am though.
Oh, now you're Annie Nocenti.
I'm Annie, yeah. So I had this idea for, when you do your very first comic, there's like mad amounts of, enthusiasm, like way too much, really. And I'd written this thing that was like a Bible, it was like just endless. I mean, I look back at like, it was like a document like this big. I invented Longshot's world and, this whole long thing. And Louise Simonson, we were looking for an artist, and these samples came in. And I kind of like telling the story. Are you guys artists or writers? Some of you? Yes? One of the things is you always see art samples that are just, the hero and the pose. And you can't really do anything with an art sample like that because you have no idea if the artist knows how to tell a story. So back then, Marvel was a very open place and you could just walk in with your portfolio and somebody up there would look at it. You'd get a call, there's somebody in the lobby who wants to go, look at the work. And, one of the things I'd always say would be to go back and show us you can tell a story. So these pages came in like out of the blue in the mail from Arthur Adams, and it was a sequence of the X-Men, but it was they're washing dishes in a kitchen. And it's like he established the characters through, I think the Beast is like, drying a dish with his foot, and it's like he established the characters and showed he could tell a story, and then it went into something more active. But basically, somehow, he just nailed it with those samples in terms of like, holy shit, this guy can make washing the dishes exciting. So, Louise, I think it was just super smart of her to give Arthur Adams, that job, even though, it was pretty scary for both of us. And then Art and I just started like jamming on ideas, and he was as enthusiastic as I was, so he would send in like pages and pages and pages of character designs. Like all these, like Mojo, from Mojo World, there were like pages and pages of minions, and then just like, I was like, well, that one, and how about that one? And so I actually don't really remember exactly like which one of us created what, but a lot of it came out of Art's brain. I think Spiral came out of his brain. I think one of the minions had extra arms, and then there'd be a conversation, well, let's give her lots of arms, So stuff evolved, and I had a cat. There was a cat living in the loft I was staying in. It only had